My grandmother kept a drawer full of birthday cards she never sent. I found that out when I was 9, digging through her bureau for a rubber band, and I pulled open the wrong drawer, and there they were, stacked neatly, sealed, addressed in her handwriting. Some were for me. One said Ellie, age 7 on the envelope. I never got it. I asked her about it once. She laughed and said she always meant to mail them but kept forgetting. I believed her then. I was 9. I'm 31 now. I don't believe much of anything my family tells me anymore. The reading of my grandmother's will happened on a Tuesday in February, which felt wrong somehow. February is the ugliest month. Gray skies, dead grass, that particular cold that gets into your coat no matter how thick it is. My grandmother deserved better than a Tuesday in February. She deserved April at least, maybe June. But there we were, my mother, my uncle, my cousin Tate, and me, sitting in a law office in Dayton, Ohio, in the kind of chairs that are designed to look expensive but are actually just uncomfortable. The lawyer's name was Mr. Fenwick. He had reading glasses on a chain and a very organized desk, and the kind of expression that told you he had seen enough family dynamics to no longer be surprised by any of them. My grandmother had passed 6 weeks earlier. Lung cancer diagnosed late, moved fast. She was 78 and sharp until almost the end. The last real conversation I had with her, she told me to always keep my own bank account, never let anyone else manage my money, and to learn how to read a contract before I signed one. I laughed because I thought she was just being grandmotherly. She looked at me very steadily and said, "I'm serious, Eleanor." She almost never called me Eleanor. My mother sat to my left in Mr. Fenwick's office, wearing the dark gray blazer she reserved for occasions she considered important. My uncle, her older brother Dennis, sat across from us, already leaning back like he was preparing to receive good news. His son Tate was next to him, 24 years old, already managing one of the 3 rental properties my grandparents had bought in the 1980s. Tate had been managing it for 2 years. I didn't know much about how that was going because nobody ever talked to me about the family properties. I worked in nonprofit fundraising. I made $52,000 a year. I drove a 10-year-old Civic and I had $8,000 in savings, and I thought that was just how things were going to be for a while. Mr. Fenwick read the will in that particular lawyer voice. Measured, neutral, no drama. He got through the small things first. Some jewelry to my mother. Some furniture to my uncle. A specific armchair to a church friend of my grandmother's. Then he got to the main assets. The 3 rental properties, valued together at roughly $1.4 million, were to be transferred into a family trust, managed jointly, with income distributed quarterly to the beneficiaries. The beneficiaries listed were my Uncle Dennis, my mother, and me. Equally, 1/3 each. My uncle laughed. Not a happy laugh. The kind of laugh that comes out when someone is caught off guard in a way they don't like. My mother said nothing. She just looked at her hands. I said, "That's okay, that's straightforward." My uncle said, "There must be something else. A codicil," or Mr. Fenwick said there was no codicil. This was the current and complete version of the will, signed 14 months ago, witnessed by 2 individuals, notarized. My uncle said, "I've been managing those properties for 7 years. Mr. Fenwick said, "Yes. The trust documentation does account for that. There's a management fee structure outlined in the trust agreement." My uncle said, "A fee structure?" Mr. Fenwick handed him a folder. My uncle looked at the folder like it had personally insulted him. We went to lunch after, the 4 of us, at a diner 2 blocks from the law office because my mother said we needed to talk. I remember thinking that the word talk in my family almost always meant something else. It meant we need to tell you something we've already decided. We got a booth. My uncle and Tate sat on one side. My mother and I sat on the other. I ordered coffee. Nobody ordered food for a while. My uncle said, "This isn't what we expected." I said, "What did you expect?" He said, "The properties should stay under unified management. It doesn't make sense to split decision-making 3 ways. It creates inefficiency." I said, "Grandma seemed to think it made sense." My mother put her hand on my arm. "Settle down," that touch said. I'd been getting that touch since I was 12 years old. My uncle said, "Look, we've talked about this, your mother and I. The sensible thing is to keep the management structure as it is. Tate handles the day-to-day. The income gets distributed, but the decisions, repairs, tenants, refinancing, stay with us." I said, "With us, meaning you and Tate." He said, "And your mother." Obviously. I looked at my mother. She was looking at the laminated menu. I said, "What does my share look like quarterly?" "Just roughly." My uncle said, "It fluctuates. Vacancies, maintenance, you can't count on a fixed number." I said, "Roughly." He said, 15, maybe 1,800 a quarter, when things are going well. I did the math in my head. 3 properties valued at $1.4 million combined. Average cap rate for residential rentals in Ohio was somewhere around 6 to 8% annually. That should be generating somewhere between $84,000 and $112,000 a year in gross rental income. Split 3 ways, my third should be between $28,000 and $37,000 a year before expenses. Even with a reasonable expense ratio, I should be seeing closer to $6,000 or $7,000 a quarter, not $1,500. I didn't say any of that at the table. I just said, "Okay, let me think about it." My mother finally looked up from the menu and gave me a small, relieved smile, like I had agreed to something. I hadn't agreed to anything. My grandmother had a financial advisor. His name was Paul. He'd been working with my grandparents since the early 2000s, and he sent a card when she passed. And I kept his contact information because something about the way my grandmother said, "Learn to read a contract," kept sitting with me like a stone in my shoe. I called Paul 3 days after the diner lunch. I told him I was trying to understand the trust structure and the income from the properties, and I wasn't sure I had the full picture. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Eleanor, I think we should meet in person." We met at his office the following Thursday. He had a printed summary ready when I got there, which told me he'd been expecting this conversation for a while. He walked me through the numbers. Gross rental income across the 3 properties for the previous year, $103,400. Not a great year. 1 unit had been vacant for 4 months. A normal year was closer to $118,000 or $122,000. I said, "And the distributions to beneficiaries?" He pulled out a separate sheet. He looked at it for a moment before he handed it to me. "Distributions to my Uncle Dennis over the past 3 years, $71,000 annually on average. Distributions to my mother, $22,000 annually on average. Distributions to my mother, $22,000 annually on average. Distributions to me, 0. Listed as non-participating beneficiary per verbal instruction of trust grantor." I read that phrase twice. Verbal instruction of trust grantor. "My grandmother." I said, "What does that mean?" Paul said, "It means someone told the trust administrator that your grandmother verbally instructed them to classify you as non-participating. It's not a legal designation. It's not in the written trust document. But it was how distributions were handled." I said, "Who told them that?" He said, "Your Uncle Dennis communicated it to the administrator when the trust was first established." I said, "When was that?" He checked his notes. "About 4 years ago." I said, "My grandmother was alive 4 years ago." He said, "Yes." I said, "Did anyone ask her?" He said, "That's a very good question. Here is what I knew about my grandmother and money. She was meticulous. She kept a ledger, an actual paper ledger, of every household expense going back to 1987. She balanced her checkbook by hand every month. She paid her taxes early. She once drove 40 minutes to return $12 in incorrect change to a grocery store because it wasn't her money and she didn't keep what wasn't hers. A woman like that does not give verbal instructions about a trust and then fail to document them. I called the attorney who drafted the trust, not Mr. Muller. Fenwick, a different attorney, the one my grandparents had used for decades. His name was Mr. Albright. He was semi-retired. He remembered my grandmother well and said she was meticulous, his exact word, and that the trust document as written named me as a full equal beneficiary with no non-participation clause. I said, "So where did non-participating beneficiary come from?" He said, "I don't know. It's not language from my office. I said, "Is there a record of my grandmother requesting that change?" He said, "Not in anything I have." I said, "Would a change like that need to be in writing?" He said, "To be legally binding, yes." Absolutely. I want to tell you what it felt like to sit in my apartment that night because I think it matters. I was not crying. I was past crying. I was in that particular cold place where you've processed enough that the grief and the anger have fused into something quieter and more focused. My grandmother's drawer full of unsent birthday cards, the armchair she always sat in that went to a church friend, the way she called me Eleanor that last conversation. I thought about my mother at the diner looking at the laminated menu while my uncle explained what my share would be. She knew. She had known. That's what the menu staring was. She couldn't look at me because she already knew. I thought about my cousin Tate, 24 years old, managing a rental property, presumably collecting a management fee, definitely benefiting from distributions that were 3 times what they should have been because my third was being redirected somewhere, $103,400 a year, 3 equal shares. My share, roughly $34,500 a year before expenses. Conservative expenses, call it 40% of gross, so net around $62,000 to split. My third, roughly $20,700 a year. They had been doing this for 4 years. 4 years of my share redirected, somewhere around $82,000, maybe more, in better income years. I had $8,000 in savings and I drove a 10-year-old Civic, and I had thought that was just how things were. I did not call my mother. I did not call my uncle. I hired an attorney. Her name is Stephanie. She's in her mid-40s, works out of a small office in Columbus, specializes in trust and estate disputes. She has a very calm way of talking that makes you feel like the problem is solvable even when it doesn't feel solvable. She looked at everything Paul gave me, everything Mr. Munther, Albright said, and she said, "The verbal instruction language is the key. It's not in the document. It's not authorized. It was communicated informally by a beneficiary, your uncle, to the trust administrator, and the administrator should have required written authorization and didn't." I said, "Is that fraud?" She said, "It's at minimum a breach of fiduciary duty by the administrator and potentially fraud, depending on what your uncle knew and intended. We'd need to establish that he knew the verbal instruction was not authorized." I said, "My grandmother would never have made that instruction." Stephanie said, "Can you establish that?" I thought about the ledger, the paper ledger she kept, going back to 1987. I said, "I think so." My grandmother's house hadn't been cleared out yet. My mother had the key and was going over on weekends to sort through things gradually. I asked if I could come one Saturday and go through some of grandmother's paperwork. My mother said of course, and she sounded relieved, like she thought I was coming to be part of the family process and not actively building a legal case. I found the ledger in the second drawer of grandmother's desk, right where I expected it to be. I also found something I didn't expect. A folder labeled in my grandmother's handwriting, "Trust, Eleanor." Inside was a printed copy of the original trust document. She had highlighted my name in 3 places. In the margin next to the beneficiary section, in her handwriting, "Equal shares, non-negotiable." Below that, a sticky note in the same handwriting. Dennis asked again about Eleanor's share. I said no. Final answer. The sticky note was dated 18 months before she died, well within the window of the supposed verbal instruction. I photographed everything with my phone. Then I put the folder back exactly where I found it, and I asked my mother if I could take the ledger to look through it, and she said yes, of course, whatever I needed. I want to tell you what my uncle said when Stephanie sent the formal notice. He called me. I didn't answer. He called my mother. She called me immediately, voice tight and high the way it gets when she's frightened. She said, "What is this?" "Eleanor, what did you do?" I said, "I hired an attorney." She said, "Why would you do that? Why wouldn't you just talk to us?" I said, "I tried talking at the diner. I was told I'd get $1,500 a quarter." She said, "That's just while we're reorganizing." I said, "Mom, I know about the verbal instruction." Silence. I said, I know Dennis told the administrator I was non-participating. I know it's not in the document. I know Grandma didn't authorize it. I found her notes. More silence. Then my mother said very quietly, "She kept notes." I said, "She kept everything." My mother said, "Eleanor." I said, "I know you knew." She didn't deny it. "I'm not you knew." She didn't deny it. I'm not going to tell you my mother is a villain. She's not. She's a person who loved her brother more than she was honest with herself, who convinced herself that what was happening was some gray area it wasn't, who looked at a laminated menu when she should have looked at her daughter. People do that. They look away. It doesn't make it better, but I understand it in a way that's taken me a long time to reach. My Uncle Dennis is a different story. I have less charitable things to say about him, and I am choosing not to say them here because Stephanie said it's better if I don't, and Stephanie is right about most things. The trust administrator settled. I won't say the exact terms because there are things I agreed not to disclose, but I will say that the $8,000 in my savings account is not the number anymore. The trust is now administered by a third party, a neutral professional, and the distributions go out quarterly and they are equal and I get mine directly. My cousin Tate, I found out later, didn't know the full picture. He knew the income was good, didn't ask hard enough questions about why. He's 24. I've decided to believe he didn't understand what he was benefiting from, even if he probably should have looked harder. He called me once after everything resolved. He said he was sorry. He sounded like he meant it. I said okay. I'm not close to him, but I don't wish him ill. My uncle and I don't speak. My mother and I are somewhere in the middle. We have coffee sometimes. It's careful. There are things neither of us brings up. She asked me once if I could forgive her and I said I was working on it, which is the most honest thing I've said to her in a long time. Here is what I think about, sometimes, late at night when the apartment is quiet. My grandmother sat at her desk and wrote equal shares. Non-negotiable in the margin of a trust document that her own son was already quietly working around. She put a sticky note on it. She dated it. She kept it in a folder with my name on it in the drawer of her desk, right where she kept everything important. She knew. She couldn't stop it from happening. Or maybe she didn't know how bad it had already gotten, how far the informal instructions had already traveled. But she left a record. She kept, as she kept everything, meticulous documentation of what she actually intended and what she was actually told and what her actual answer was. She was a woman who kept birthday cards she never sent, and a paper ledger going back to 1987, and a folder labeled with my name that said, in her handwriting, that I was not to be cut out. She left me the folder like she left me the armchair she gave to someone else. She couldn't always control what happened, but she could make sure the truth existed somewhere, in writing, in a drawer, waiting for the right person to open it. I keep the folder on my desk now. I keep it there to remember that documentation is its own form of love, that keeping records is how some people protect the people they care about when they know they might not be around to do it themselves. And I keep it there to remember that the truth doesn't expire, it just waits. My grandmother's birthday cards are in a box in my closet now. I took them when we cleared the house. All of them, the ones addressed to me, the ones addressed to others, all the ones she sealed and stamped and then kept instead of sending. I don't know exactly why she didn't send them. I've stopped trying to figure it out, but on my birthday last year, my 31st, I opened the envelope that said Ellie, age 7, and I read what she wrote inside. She said, "You are going to be the one who figures things out. I just know it. Happy birthday, my love." She was right. She was 24 years early, but she was right. I spent a lot of time thinking about what actually happened in that law office in Dayton, not the legal part, the human part. 4 people sitting in expensive-looking, uncomfortable chairs, and 3 of them already knew something. The 4th one didn't. That's not a family meeting. That's a setup. What I've come to understand is that the consequences my Uncle Dennis faced weren't punishment handed down by some outside force. They were the direct and logical result of his own choices, catching up with him at the speed that choices always do, which is slower than you expect, but inevitable. He made a decision to intercept what wasn't his. He communicated a false instruction to a trust administrator. He sat across from me at a diner and told me I'd be receiving $1,500 a quarter and watched my face while I did the math and said nothing. Every single one of those decisions had a cost attached to it. He just hadn't paid yet. That's the thing about dishonesty that people tend to miscalculate. It doesn't feel costly in the moment. In the moment, it feels efficient. You get what you want. Nobody says anything. Life continues, but it accumulates. Every false thing you say or do becomes something you have to maintain, something you have to remember, something you have to keep other people from finding out. And the more you accumulate, the more exposure you carry around with you. My grandmother knew this. She kept records not because she was paranoid, but because she understood that the truth, unsupported, is fragile. Documented, it becomes something else entirely. I think about her writing, equal shares, non-negotiable in the margin of that trust document. She didn't do that because she expected to be betrayed, or maybe she did, a little, and didn't want to say so. She did it because she was intelligent enough to understand that good intentions mean nothing without evidence. That love, to actually protect someone, sometimes has to be put in writing. That's the lesson I carry now, and it has nothing to do with distrust. It has to do with clarity, being clear about what you mean, putting it where it can be found, not leaving the people you care about to rely on someone else's version of what you wanted. My grandmother gave me the most practical gift she could. A paper trail, a folder with my name on it, a sticky note with a date. Courage for me wasn't filing the legal claim, though that took something too. It was the moment I sat across from my mother at that diner and didn't agree to something I knew was wrong just to keep the peace. It was choosing the discomfort of confrontation over the false comfort of being liked. That's the part nobody tells you about standing up for yourself. It doesn't feel heroic. It feels lonely and exhausting and uncertain. And you do it anyway, because the alternative is spending the rest of your life knowing you chose silence when you should have spoken. My grandmother left me $1,500 a quarter, according to my uncle. She actually left me a folder, a ledger, a sticky note, and a birthday card that said I was going to be the one who figured things out. She was right about what mattered.